Okay, great. So thank you very much for inviting me. I really do appreciate it. I'm currently actually writing up these excavations for publication. So it's a really great opportunity to be able to think through them for a presentation for tonight and to think about how I make sense of some of the kind of conclusions we have. Now, I actually gave a talk to ACFA about these sites back in 2018 or 2019. We have since then done quite a bit of post-excavation analysis, and we've got some nice radiocarbon dates as well. And hopefully some of the conclusions that I'll draw out tonight are new to you all, those of you who've heard some of this talk before. It's a slightly strange talk in many ways, a slightly strange project for me. Castle Qua and Black Hill were excavated back in 2017 as part of Cavlap Heritage. Now, Cavlap Heritage was a programme that was delivered by Northlight Heritage as part of the Clyde and Avon Valley Landscape Partnership between 2015 and 2018. It was funded by Historic Environment Scotland, the National Lottery and Leader. It was a major project in the region. There's 11 different partners: North and South Lanarkshire Council, RSPB, Scottish Wildlife Trust, amongst many others. £5 million fund. Huge amount of work done, not just in archaeology, but on natural and cultural heritage across the area. So it was a really successful project, many great outcomes and outputs. However, that finished in 2017. 2018, we had some legacy money to do some more work around places like Draffin, and then we had the Clutha project emerging out of that, which has then since gone on to do some amazing stuff. As I said, we're part of Northlight Heritage, and unfortunately, Northlight Heritage was shut in 2019. We all lost our jobs, all got made redundant, and this project kind of went by the wayside. It was kind of in the ether, really. Gavin McGregor, who was the director of Northlight Heritage, continued Northlight to a certain extent, but then obviously things like the pandemic hit, which was very difficult. We weren't really clear if we were ever going to get this out to publication at all. But these things kind of, circumstances change. Gavin has since become the director of Archaeology Scotland, where I work now, and a bit of the money that was part of that project kind of get continued on. And now we have a few days, 10 days, to finally write up these excavations. So it's been a long road. Hopefully the report publication will be out this year. So I feel it's quite a strange project for me. It's been a long time I've been thinking about these sites. And as I say, tonight, hopefully you'll hear some conclusions about them, and really it'll show just how little we know about the Iron Age in this area. So a bit of context. Okay, so this is the area we're talking about. You can see Glasgow up there. This is the kind of area here with Lanark and Kirkmuir Hill and Lark Hall just above us here. This is the kind of a more detailed area of the site. So we've got Lanark down here, and Castle Qua is just located to the north of Lanark on the Cartland Crags, and Black Hill is located to the west on a large igneous intrusion in Black Hill Farm. So some of the kind of context about how this project emerged. So the site investigations form part of a project which we delivered as part of the wider programme called Investigating the Past. And this was really, we designed this to be a project that focused on the wider landscape of our study area during the first millennia BC AD of the whole kind of Clyde and Avon Valley. It was designed to work with volunteers and students and service users to get access to archaeological excavations. It was really the only kind of digs we did as part of the programme. There was lots of survey work that many of you were obviously involved in, but this was really the only kind of set piece archaeology we did as part of this. Now, Castle Qua was chosen long before we got involved in the project, and I don't think, for many reasons will become apparent, we would have chosen this site to investigate. But it was chosen for a number of different reasons, but it was really kind of emerged out of the design of the landscape partnership. So there's a thing called the Landscape Conservation Action Plan that all these landscape partnerships had. And as you can see there, it says, we currently know extremely little about this important site in the National Nature Reserve. The project will add colour and interest to the historical and cultural story of the reserve and inform future management of the castle. And it would engage members of local history societies to have an opportunity to do research, help with interpretation for the benefit of visitors to the site. Now, even at the time when we were starting to design the project, we wouldn't have coached it in those terms. And having done the project, and I think now, 10 years later, that is just not how we would do a community archaeological project. And really what we found was it was the ACFA gang that really helped us, especially the cohort which we taught in that period. I think it was in 2015, 2016. I think we engaged with a lot of your members, and we'd developed a few kind of local volunteers as well. So it was quite a kind of a strange project. So that's the kind of background of it, really. As I said, we wouldn't have chosen this for a number of reasons, not least because it was situated in the National Nature Reserve, which meant it was a triple SI, site of special scientific interest. There was badgers literally eroding the rampart, so we couldn't dig within, what was it, 30 metres of the badgers. It's a scheduled monument, so we had to get permission from Historic Environment Scotland. It was covered in trees, massive mature trees and lots of coppice trees. It was really badly, you couldn't really kind of work out what was going on at all. It was really difficult access. We had to walk up a huge big track for about, I don't know, 2 miles or a mile or something like that. But hoofing stuff up this massive track, you can see Ed and Elsa doing their best. I was thinking it was the first morning, thinking, what the heck are we doing here? So we were kind of thinking, how do we engage a wider audience? How do we get more people on site to do more things? And obviously, with Gavin in charge, he gets excited and has lots of energetic ambitions. And obviously, my personal interest in the Iron Age of the area, we decided we wanted to focus on a few different sites. Now, we did some geophysics on a few different sites, which I won't talk about tonight, but we thought we would engage or look at the biggest site in the area. Black Hill dominates the whole of the valley, and we thought it'd be quite an interesting comparison site to look at as well. So we investigated 2 sites during this period, which is maybe a bit ambitious at times. So to think about the research context of this, you can see where the project emerged from the LCAP and from the Landscape Partnership, but there is a research agenda behind this, and we had to kind of apply the research kind of framework to the project. It wasn't really kind of the other way around, which you would normally get in an archaeological project. So how do we fit in Castle Qua into the broader national and regional research frameworks? Luckily for the Iron Age, Strathclyde is regarded as a black hole in Iron Age research for Britain. It's a really influential paper, Understanding the British Iron Age, an Agenda for Action, written in 2001, which describes black hole areas like Strathclyde, amongst other parts of Scotland, as areas without well-established regional frameworks or synthesis of sites. And most have few known Iron Age sites, with little or no coherent history of investigation or no easily accessible sources. Now, this was kind of the case in 2017. Obviously, for Lanarkshire, there was the Royal Commission inventory, which was published in 1978. That really emerged out of the 1950s Marginal Landscape Survey. So there had been a lot of actual research done in the area in terms of surveying. Lots of amateur archaeology had been done over the years. Frank Newell, for instance, in Renfrewshire. Lots of work in the Glasgow Archaeology Society, excavated sites in Glasgow, and there was stuff down in Ayrshire. There was antiquarian archaeologists like David Christensen, who did huge amounts of survey work in the area. And increasingly, there was a lot of commercial work being done. Sites like Bray Head had been excavated in the early 2000s. And there was a picture emerging, really, of what the Iron Age looked like in the area at the time. But this has since really accelerated since 2017. Since we did these digs, we did 2 sites as part of our project. We did another site at Draffin in 2018. There's been a lot of commercial archaeology work done recently in the area, including a Hindford Quarry by AOC just down the road. And Headland have excavated a site at Wood End Farm further down the Clyde. So we are starting to understand this area a bit more. Part of the work I want to do in the next few months is really kind of draw this together and really be able to say something a bit more about the Iron Age of the area. And certainly for the new research framework, which is emerging, as I've talked to you about before, this is one of the kind of priorities I'd like to focus on. So that's the national kind of research background. Looking at the Scottish research framework, our project was aligned to the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework, in particular the Iron Age theme 6 on enclosed places. So each of the sites had their own specific research questions, which I'll go into in a minute. But broadly, we were looking to date the sites. We didn't know what date these sites were, when they were built, when they go out of use, are they multi-period or single periods, who built these sites, what were they used for, what does it tell us about social structure in the area, and what practices took place within them. So the idea of trying to think about a chronology for the area, that was really important. Trying to think about things like social structure. Were our investigations able to tell us about, were they elite sites, were they communal sites, were they, can we say something about the different size sites, and how does that then relate to the broader knowledge for the area? Can we fit it into a broader framework for Strathclyde? Looking at Castle Qua first, actually, when we first started the project, and even probably during it, many of our volunteers and even ourselves were thinking, what we up to here? But I think actually what emerged was a really interesting site, and the archaeology really allowed us to answer some quite interesting, quite important questions about the site. So it was first depicted on the name Qua was first depicted as a kind of small site on Pont's map in 1596. So quite a long history of knowledge about this site. As part of the LCAP, part of the design of the programme, Richard Oram, Professor Richard Oram at Stirling University, did a huge amount of research on the area, and he noted that in 1617 there was a land transaction document that mentions Castle Qua, not as a site itself, but it mentions it as kind of part of a kind of land, a farm. I think it's part of a land transaction. He suggested that the site might have been associated with Simon Lockhart, who had the lordship of the Lee in the 12th century, and that this would be his lordly residence, the Caput, for his power centre. He assigned that interpretation because there's no other known site of the period in the area, and that the idea was he then moved to his current location where Lee House currently sits. So the idea was this was maybe a site that the lordship of the Lee used and then moved to where the Lee estate is now. Another suggestion was that this was some sort of like pseudo-history which developed around the site. If you look at the Ordnance Survey map of the area, it's regarded as a rectangular site that says site of the Castle of Qua. So there's maybe some stories associated with it, that it might be a medieval site. Certainly there's lots of every castle and house and cave was visited by William Wallace in Lanarkshire, particularly in Lanark. So there's a lot of kind of like stories around medieval sites in Lanarkshire. It's depicted in William Roy's map, as you can see here, this kind of oval enclosure with maybe some sort of palisade or some rampart within it here. And it was described in the Old Statistical Account of Scotland in 1795, when it was described by William Lockhart as bounded by traces of a double ditch on the land side, enclosing half a rood of ground, and on the side next to the river a precipice of some 200 feet. That was a health and safety concern for us when I was writing the risk assessment. And that there was some underground kind of culverts or stone arches that he actually saw being opened, and that at the bottom of it there was a fat black earth intermixed with some bones in the state of ashes. So there was some suggestion and other evidence that this might be some sort of souterrain, which would be a kind of unusual location for a souterrain. So maybe a hint of an Iron Age site there, but certainly people leaning towards a kind of more medieval interpretation for the site. The site was formally surveyed back in 1973 as part of the Lanarkshire volume by Archams, and was interpreted as a medieval site, almost certainly medieval. It was regarded as an earthwork site, and there's very little evidence. If you look at the commission inventory, it's kind of a couple of lines about the site. It's kind of dismissed as being a medieval site. It was reassessed in 2013 alongside Richard Orham's research, historical research. The Royal Commission went out to survey the site, and a possible potential Bailey area was identified to the north of the site in a kind of flat area. And there's a kind of strange kind of earthwork kind of protruding from the top of the earthwork that was interpreted as a bridge. Now, if you look at the Atlas for Hill Forts project of the site, which was written by the same author, Strat Halliday, he's quite not dismissive of it really, but dismissive of it being an Iron Age site, and in that it would probably be some sort of bridge or kind of drawbridge kind of element, and that a feature like this would be unique in Iron Age for fortifications. And though it doesn't rule out the possibility of an earlier occupation, like somewhere like Dundonald Castle, there's an Iron Age antecedents there. It suggests that it's a medieval castle akin to a ringwork. So that's aligning with Richard Orham's historical understanding of the site and what these surveyors kind of thought. So one of the kind of key questions for the site was, is it Iron Age or is it, medieval? That was one of our kind of key questions. So the site itself is D-shaped. It's around 28 metres by 30 metres in extent. It's defined on the surface with a massive, massive rampart. Two large ditches, the outermost one, which only partially survives, in the south east of the site, down here. You can see it just down here, surviving. You can just see a small trace of that. The rampart is about 4 metres wide and about 2.4 metres high. It's greatest extent in the interior. So you can see some of the team here doing some geophysics within the centre of the site. You can see that for scale, that's the inside of the site, and that's the size of the rampart. This is interpreted as the Bailey area, and you can see it, I don't know if you can see it sloping down there towards the base of the interior of the ditch, and then the rampart rising above it there. So, quite a substantial earthwork site, but it enclosed an absolutely tiny area. It's only 0.04 hectares, so really kind of small enclosure for the size of the rampart. So quite a kind of strange site. And going back to that interpretation of the potential souterrain, where there was some internal features as well within the site. So quite a kind of enigmatic, unusual site. So, as I said, it's a scheduled monument. So we were extremely restricted in terms of what we could do in terms of intervention. We obviously had to ask for permission to do the project, get scheduled monument consent. We could excavate 3 trenches across the area. So we're really restricted in terms of archaeological questions. As I said, it's a triple SI, mature trees, and there's badgers as well. The badgers were kind of all in this area here, so we really couldn't, investigate this area at all. We did get permission to do geophysics as well. I won't talk about that tonight. The results were pretty inconclusive, but I can send you a report if you would like to see some of that. The report also has the work we did at Double Dykes at Stonehouse, if you want to have a look at that as well. So we excavated. We were going to excavate 3 trenches due to the logistical issues. Which were many, we only excavated 2 trenches. So we excavated the trench 1, which ran from the potential Bailey area down to the bottom of the rampart in the outside, and trench 2 in the interior where we did the geophysics in the interior there. The red area there is the scheduled monument. So in the Bailey area, so in the upper part of the trench, so up here in this area here, we came down onto a series of kind of very shallow pits, very ephemeral kind of archaeology. This was probably the best example of what we found, the kind of large kind of pits, very shallow, with lots of stones in it, and lots of post-medieval artifacts. So lots of bits of china and glass. metal. There was one piece of maybe post-medieval pottery, but no evidence really for medieval activity at all that we discovered in this part of the site. These pits we interpreted as being related to the coppicing. So as I said, it's a mature forest, but there's lots of evidence of coppice trees. So probably some sort of kind of industrial activity related to the coppicing. So really no clear evidence of medieval activity at that stage. What we did find, however, as some of you were aware of, was an absolutely humongous ditch. It was absolutely huge. So what we think is this is the outer ditch. So we have the inner ditch here, and then this outer ditch coming round. So instead of following this dotted line, what it does is probably comes round and curves in here into this bit here. So this is where the trench was. So the trench was kind of in this area here, and this is where the ditch was. So absolutely humongous. Rock cut, so it cut through the natural bedrock. Huge proportion, huge excavation. The ditch itself was almost 4 meters wide at the top. It was 2.7 meters deep, so almost 3 meters deep. It's really hard to kind of think about the scale of this. That's a meter long rod iron there. So if you think about that, so if you're standing on it, you'd be up to maybe there, head height. So it was really pretty substantial. It's a huge effort by all the volunteers to excavate this. And then on the inner side, so the enclosure is down in this direction here, if that makes sense. And this is a large rampart here. So the rampart was about 3 meters wide. It only survived to about 30 centimeters in height, but it was filled with cobbles and stones, probably excavated from the actual earth, the bedrock itself, and then mounted up on the inside to create a rampart. So this is the second of the two ditches that would enclose this really tiny site. So really substantial piece of engineering, filled with a couple of smaller deposits, initial deposits, two initial deposits of infill, probably when the site was initially opened, and then a really homogeneous fill of very kind of brown, silty sand, really. Really difficult to understand how it was filled up, if it was maybe ploughed in really quickly, or if it gradually filled up. I would suspect it's probably been filled in pretty quickly. That was the kind of interpretation at the time. We did take some Cubiana samples of the site, but unfortunately they didn't work. We couldn't really analyse how the deposits were formed. So I think to really understand how that deposit was formed, we'd have to go back and kind of really excavate it again. Amazingly, we got some radiocarbon dates from the very bottom of the ditch, which are really, really exciting because it gives us an Iron Age date. So you can see here, these dates here, with a 95% probability from the initial silting up of the ditch. We have a date from 207 to 247 Cal BC. So, really, obviously we don't know exactly how. That's from a piece of alder charcoal. We don't know exactly how that bit of charcoal got into the bottom of the ditch. It could have been washed in, as a residual feature, but I think it probably is. I think we have some certainty about that it is probably a middle Iron Age ditch. It's the only date we got from the site. We'd have to go back to do much more excavation and radiocarbon dating to really kind of get a handle on it. But that is quite exciting, I think. And certainly worth all the effort we put in. In the interior of the site, Trench 2, not Trench 1, I forgot to change that. We got some quite interesting evidence of structural archaeology here. You can see there was probably some sort of wall and then either collapse or an internal floor surface. We didn't time didn't really allow us to excavate much of that, apart from a very small slot through the wall, which came right directly onto the natural subsoil. So, unfortunately, I don't know what this structure is. if it's part of a roundhouse for an Iron Age site or maybe a later medieval site, structure. Is it the foundations of a much more substantial medieval structure or building? We did get, however, a couple of quite nice work stones. There was no medieval archaeology at all. There's no pottery. There was no, other kind of metal work that we'd expect to find in a medieval site. But we did get two work stones, which Anne Clark, the stone tool specialist, suggests are of later prehistoric date. This one in particular is a smoother, which she has suggested could only really come from the Iron Age. It's not of any other date. So really exciting finds. And we found that in the trenches, we thought it was something. These waterborne pebbles couldn't have got there any other way. Humans would have brought them to site. We've had them analysed and they are work stones. So really exciting. We probably have Iron Age activity on the site. It probably dates to the Iron Age. The enclosing works are probably of the Iron Age dates. So I think we've answered some of the research questions there really conclusively, well, mostly conclusively, and I think we're quite excited about those results. Moving on to Black Hill now. This site was probably the earliest evidence that we really have for it is on William Roy's map, where he described, he as you can see there, annotates it as the Black Hill with some sort of, curvilinear feature on top. So obviously William Roy was a keen observer of archaeology, and he is from the area, from near Carluke. So he would have well known this site as a youth growing up. So he depicted this as the Black Hill. The first written evidence we have is from 1864, when Vere Irving, who was, I think, the head of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, or certainly the Society of Antiquaries down south, he talks about a camp much obliterated by a thriving plantation. And this is reflected in the first edition survey map of the same year, where we have Black Hill covered in trees. We didn't know this at the time when we were excavating. There is still some trees there now, but we didn't actually know that at the time. It was quite a confusing picture, really, when we were looking at the ordnance survey maps. We couldn't quite understand what was going on. It was later described by James Young, who excavated the tumulus, the cairn down at Black Hill Farm, which is another scheduled monument. He excavated the cairn down here where he found a number of bodies. And he mentions the cairn on top of Black Hill and the small British camp with a fosse, much dilapidated and difficult to examine. It is only 35 feet in diameter to the outer fosse. Now, I'm not really sure exactly which element of the site he's talking about, probably the settlement element. So there is some antiquary interest in it. David Christensen also notes it as well. But it wasn't really until the Marginal Land Survey in the 1950s that we get a clearer picture of the site. Now, of course, ACFA excavated it in the late 90s or early 90s as well. I did have a copy of that report a few years ago when I was at Northlight. I've since lost it, so I'm going to have to try and get a copy of that before I finish writing up for publication. So, Black Hill. This is the 1970s plan, and this is a nice aerial photograph of the site. It comprises of four kind of main elements. There's a large Bronze Age cairn, which forms part of the National Trust for Scotland's viewpoint. And if you've not been up to the site, I thoroughly recommend it, even just to go to see the site, see the view. It is unbelievable. The panoramic view you have for the whole of the West Central Scotland. You can see absolute miles right up to the Highlands, all the way to Annan. It's really, really spectacular. And of course, over to the east as well. So really, really a commanding place, especially quite an interesting site for a Bronze Age cairn. I'm not going to talk about much about the Bronze Age tonight, but really interesting. It's an oval fort. There's a large oval fort defined by a rampart, which encloses an area about 1.2 hectares in extent. Attached to this is an enclosure or a settlement defined by a double rampart with a medial ditch, and this abuts the site in two locations. And associated with that were a number of platforms, only a couple identified by the Commission, many more, I think, identified by ACFA. And that's certainly borne out on the ground as well. I think you can see many more internal features in this settlement area. There was also a couple of medieval earthworks or post-medieval earthworks running across the site. This one here, which Ian excavated down there. I'm not going to talk about that tonight, Ian. This one here, this wall here with this, what looks like a square enclosure running off of it. So we excavated 5 trenches across the site. Again, it's a scheduled monument, so we had a very limited amount of opportunity to do any kind of intervention here. Some scholars get lots of permission to do scheduled monuments, but for some reason we were only getting a small amount. Anyway. So we had a lot of interesting questions we thought we wanted to answer. Was there a pre-enclosure activity of the site, potentially, and particularly related to the Bronze Age cairn? Was it in fact a Bronze Age cairn? Was it reused in a later period? There's a lot of evidence for Iron Age people re-excavating Bronze Age cairns and then building houses on top of them. When was it first enclosed? How was it constructed? When did it go out of use? How was it used? What kind of different evidence can we see for different types of enclosure in the site? And what was the nature of these kind of post-medieval enclosures or linear features that ran across the site? So we excavated, as I said, five trenches. Trench 1 was across the cairn. I'm not going to talk about too much about the cairn, only to say that it was actually it's a very sophisticated monument. It's not just a pile of stones. We see a cairn in the landscape, we think, it's just a big mound of stones. Actually, there's a lot more to it than that. There was a radial, multiple kerbs and radial patterns from the centre, all different types of stone and different shapes of stones that are using different types of stone to create a very deliberate kind of nesting pattern up to the centre of the site. So quite an interesting architecturally. Unfortunately, we didn't find any evidence for burial within it. As I said, you can see this very small slot we had here. So it's a 2-metre wide trench. We're only allowed to excavate 1 metre of that. And of that, we're only allowed to go down to undisturbed cairn material. So very, very limited amount of excavation, really. On the top of the cairn, so you can see here these radial lines of kerbs, which were quite distinct on the excavation. On top of the cairn, there was a pit excavated with loads of burning, loads of charcoal, and within that pit there was a lot of 19th century artefacts, including the J. Jolly stone, bit of probably Victorian graffiti there, some chap called J. Jolly. Did he excavate the pit and then backfill it? Or I say he, it could have been anyone, of course. Did they backfill it? Lots of bits of broken glass, there was lots of metal as well. There was quite interesting bone assemblage. Mainly, we think of animal, 99% sure it's animal, with this really interesting pattern on it, this kind of fabric pattern, which we're not sure what it is. The bone specialist had never seen this before, so if you've ever seen anything like this, please do let me know. Probably of animals, of ribs. The charcoal was mainly of Scots pine. Now, Scots pine only really comes in the medieval, post-medieval periods in the area, and I think it's probably to do with this plantation, which we have seen evidence for in the maps. Probably planted sometime between William Roy's depiction of the site, where you can really see the archaeology. 100 years later, there's a plantation on it, so probably in that 100-year period, lots of Scots pine getting planted, and a lot of burning as well. So, are they going up to this really prominent site and having some sort of bonfire on site? Is it some sort of beacon site? There is obviously stories about Victorian beacons, or are they just going up there for parties and then leaving the rubbish behind? Is one interpretation of it. There's probably multiple others, but I think quite a nice wee story kind of coming together about that. Unfortunately, we didn't get any radiocarbon dating from that material. Going to the earthworks now before I go on to the ramparts of the fort. This is the large 10 by 10 trench over that kind of square enclosure we thought would be interesting to investigate, and the wall. It turned out, and it was quite ephemeral, this probably looked like more of a circular feature of stones. It was very badly robbed and cut by the wall. So probably it might, so two interpretations we have for it. One being that it could be a cairn, and that there was maybe potentially a central kist within that. Again, we weren't allowed to excavate that. We were allowed to put in one slot across it, so we're not sure if there was any burials within that slot. There was no other features associated with it, so no other post holes, and there was no artifacts at all. So I'm probably thinking it's probably more like a cairn, maybe another Bronze Age cairn. The wall itself, there was a potential early 19th century coin. Donald Beatson had a look at it at the Hunterian. He thinks it's probably an early 19th century coin. So that potentially dates the construction of the wall, again associated with this plantation episode. So, quite an interesting feature. Again, we'd have to go back and excavate that more to really kind of figure out what that was. Looking at the fort rampart itself, this was excavated over the northern portion of the rampart, which was badly damaged already. It was really denuded, and it clearly been robbed quite heavily. One of the reasons we're allowed permission to excavate over the rampart was because we weren't going to excavate part of the rampart that was very well preserved. We were only allowed to dig a very small slot through the rampart as well. So again, really keyhole kind of excavations here. The rampart looks like it was built mainly by a jumble of kind of random stones piled directly on top of the old ground surface. This is probably just a foundational layer, but there were some facing stones on the outer side of the site of the rampart, which were of the pink felsite material. So the felsite is the igneous intrusion that the fort sits on the hill. So they're probably quarrying this felsite out of the hill and then using that deliberately to construct the facade of the ramparts itself. So this kind of, you would be able to see it from a long distance away, potentially, this kind of pink and sparkly facade, potentially. As I said, we excavated a small slot through the rampart, and we amazingly discovered a whole cache of pottery. We were very lucky, I think, in this slot that we excavated this, and that this material is from one pot. We had it analysed. It's from one pot, but that's pretty much all we can say about it. It's completely undiagnostic, really. It's broadly later prehistoric in date, from the late Bronze Age all the way through to the early medieval period. We don't have any money at the moment to do any more analysis on this. Anne McSween, the pottery specialist, looked at it and was, that's all she could really see about it. So unfortunately, we don't have any kind of understanding about what this pot was used for. And unfortunately, the radiocarbon date we got back from underneath the rampart was from a piece of Scots pine, which was related to the 19th century plantation of the site. So we got a 19th century date from underneath this rampart. So really unfortunate kind of circumstances there. If we had more money, we could potentially do some more radiocarbon dates of some of the oak charcoal which was found from underneath it, but that's for another day, unfortunately. Moving on to the settlement rampart, as I said, this was a kind of ditch with two ramparts. When we excavated it, we discovered it was a large V-shaped ditch, and that each of the ramparts had palisade slots excavated through them. So we're seeing between 1 and 3 phases of enclosure here. So we're not sure if the palisades were contemporary with the ditch and ramparts, or if they went in at a later date. Potentially not that much later, but potentially, a different phase of enclosure. The ditch itself was filled with slumped material from the rampart, and it contained lots of charcoal of oak and alder, which the botanical specialist has suggested may be an element of the rampart construction. They might have had palisade oak timbers within it, which is obviously not unusual in the period, or the palisades themselves are of oak, which is potentially quite interesting and reflects what is seen in other parts of Strathclyde, where you have oak palisades defining sites. Certainly the Braehead and Leven, you see this evidence, and I think the new site down at Wood End as well. This is the site, the trench from a different angle. You can see the depth of the palisade there through the rampart, just in the foreground, with the ditch in the middle there. So quite a substantial site as well. This enclosed quite a small area of 0.35 hectares, so much smaller than the fort itself. And luckily, the radiocarbon dating worked on this settlement, which allows us to say a few different things about the site. The first radiocarbon date was from the slumped material of the rampart. So the material slumped into the ditch itself. And from that, we got a piece of alder charcoal, which gave us a calibrated date from 171 to 278 BC. So kind of later Iron Age. And there was a small hearth directly below the inner rampart, which got a radiocarbon date, again from a piece of charcoal, alder charcoal, from 204 to 341 Cal BC. So, broadly contemporary dates, which is quite interesting. And I think allows us to say that this site is probably kind of that period. So the dating of Black Hill. So the settlement was probably built between 341 and 171 Cal BC, around that period, give or take a few years, obviously. So this dates the settlement element of the site to the middle to late Iron Age. Now the settlement abuts the rampart of the fort, so the fort is earlier in date. Now we don't know how much earlier in date. It could be only a few years, but I would suggest it probably dates to the earlier Iron Age or even the late Bronze Age. Many of these large sites that have been excavated have late Bronze Age dates associated with them. So a site probably, and given it the fact there's a Bronze Age cairn on the site, probably a kind of later Bronze Age site, which was then reoccupied in the kind of middle to late Iron Age. So really great results from the excavations in terms of the date of the settlement. Unfortunately, we didn't really get much evidence about kind of what activities were taking place within the site, and really we'd want to go back and excavate a much larger area in the interior of the site, because there's been so few of these hill forts excavated in Scotland, never mind in Lanarkshire or South Lanarkshire, that we really don't know what's going on inside them. So some conclusions from the excavations before I go on briefly to talk about what this means in a larger regional context. So Castle Qua probably dates to the Iron Age, the Middle Iron Age, 207 to 347 is our radiocarbon date. The artifacts are probably of Iron Age date as well, and there was no clear evidence of medieval activity. So I think we can probably say it's an Iron Age, later prehistoric site. The enclosing works were absolutely, as I say, massive. Only in a sense, I've never really excavated something like that before, apart from Doomster Hill in Govan. It was the only time I excavated a huge big trench like that, a big ditch. So really massively substantial. Enclosing a tiny space, 0.4 hectares in extent. Really huge amount of engineering work compared to the size of space it was enclosing. This is in contrast to Black Hill, which is obviously a much larger site, but still kind of substantial earthworks defining both the rampart of the fort and the enclosure of the settlement. And at the settlement probably dates to 171 to 341 Cal BC, so in the middle to late Iron Age, and at the fort is probably earlier than that. The sites, both Castle Qua and Black Hill, are probably roughly contemporary in date, which is really great result. So what does that mean in terms of the Lanarkshire and in terms of this black hole area? So traditionally, the Scottish Iron Age is seen as hierarchical in nature. Ian Banks, now battlefield archaeology, not Iron Age archaeology, wrote an interesting paper, Always the Bridesmaid, the Iron Age of West, was it West Central Scotland or Southwest Scotland back in 2002, where he talks about some sort of hierarchy in settlement types, the agency of settlements. And this is really kind of reflects a long-standing tradition within Iron Age scholarship, and really reflected based on the work by Cunliffe, but reflected in people like Dennis Harding, Ian Ralston, about this kind of idea that hill forts, the residence of the kings and their retinue, and that larger farms should be seen as residences of noble families, the smaller enclosures and open settlements being homes for lower ranks of client farmers. So a really hierarchical system, this settlement, the idea that the settlements themselves reflect this form of social hierarchy, and that it's very much based on a kind of kingship model of the medieval period, and an Enlightenment idea of how Iron Age people saw their worlds of culture and nature being able to be exploited, and a capitalist system or a feudal system. So that's the kind of traditional interpretation we have for the period. But if we look at the evidence, how does that really reflect in the evidence? So looking at Strathclyde, or in general, there are only 16 sites in the whole of Strathclyde that are over 1 hectare in extent. Now, if these are all Iron Age in date or late Bronze Age in date, they might all be contemporary, of course. So very, very few sites that can be considered as large sites. The vast majority of sites in the Strathclyde area are tiny. They're less than a quarter of a hectare in size. So it seems like everyone really is living in these small sites, like Castle Qua. That Black Hill and sites like it are actually not normal sites. Now, one interpretation, of course, could be that's where the king is living, that's where the chieftain of the tribe is living, in these big sites. And everyone else is living in these smaller sites, reflecting Cunliffe's idea, reflecting Ian Banks's idea, reflecting all the kind of traditional interpretation. But when you look at the evidence, the archaeological evidence of this doesn't bear out, I think. Very few of the sites in the Strathclyde area have been excavated. Harpercroft down in Ayrshire, excavated in the 80s or the 70s ahead of excavation of the radar station there. Encloses an area of 6.5 hectares. A few wee bits of pottery, just like Black Hill. There's some shale bangles. The kind of ubiquitous material culture of the Iron Age of Strathclyde is black shale bangles. Everyone's wearing them. And that's pretty much it. That's all we've got. It's a site of multiple enclosures with ramparts being cut by palisades, just like Black Hill. So very similar in many ways. Walls Hill in Renfrewshire, the largest site in the region, really, excavated by Frank Newell back in the 60s. Again, really small amount of material culture, a few bits of pottery, some shale bangles, some work stones. Kind of a rampart not dissimilar to Walls Hill, and interestingly though, a kind of a potential roundhouse within the enclosure as well. But they're not screaming. I mean, we've excavated so little of these sites. I mean, you can see the size of the trenches we were excavating in the smallest slot through it. It's hard really to kind of draw out any conclusions, but not screaming high status sites really. They're big, they're massive. But does size matter, as the saying goes? Looking at the smaller sites that have been excavated, again, probably more of these sites have been excavated, and certainly on a larger scale, Bray Head being one of the only fully excavated sites in the area, sitting below IKEA in Bray Head as we speak, or certainly demolished anyway. A multi-phase site, lots of phases of palisades, multiple phases of palisades, multiple phases of ditches and ramparts being excavated, and multiple phases of settlement being constructed. It is a site of craftworking speciality where shale bangles were being made. So a rich site in many ways. Castle Qua, which we excavated, massively substantial earthworks, really huge amount of earthwork, engineering, some quite mundane stone tools, really. Another unusual site is the Leven in Ayrshire near Loudon, which is again was a palisaded site with multiple phases of palisades, and there was some high prestige items there, in the form of some nice tweezers, as well as domestic artifacts. So we're actually seeing kind of a broadly similar material culture being seen in these sites, but given that these sites have been excavated to a much larger scale, we're seeing craft specialisation and craft working, we're seeing more prestige items, and we're seeing this huge amount of engineering in terms of multiple phases of enclosure. Really huge amount of work being put in there. What does that mean then? We're seeing potentially the grammar of power. These are some of the sites in Lanarkshire. So all kind of broadly similar size and shape, broadly similar entrance orientations, broadly similar material culture. What we're potentially seeing in these multiple phases of enclosure is this grammar of power, which Niall Sharples has talked about in relation to the Iron Age of Wessex, where he talks about the idea of labour as potlatch, this North American, Native American idea, where labour, the control of labour and the giving of labour is seen as a mechanism of how people, and the elites in particular, display their power. So they're not showing their power off by building these huge sites, although that does happen. You're seeing it in the gathering of resources. So imagine building a palisade and how many trees you'd have to fell to build these palisades. How many people did it take to excavate that small amount of ditch that we excavated at Castle Qua? If you think about the labour that would go into constructing these ditches and palisades over multiple periods of time. So the idea would be that a family would call in their favours, call in their neighbours, provide food and support, and their neighbours would build their ditches for them or help construct their palisades. By doing so, that family would then be in debt to that other family, that other group, that they would therefore reciprocate that labour at a different time. And that reciprocation would continue over generations. And that's where we're seeing potentially these multiple phases of enclosure and these multiple phases of elite competition, where we're seeing power and social structure played out in very different ways in this idea of a social triangle. And that society is maybe potentially more heterarchical in nature. And this potentially continues right up until we get to the introduction of the Romans, where the landscape is very, very different. We see a landscape denuded of trees. So imagine all these palisades being built over generations. There's no trees left. If you look at the environmental evidence, there's no trees left. The Romans come into this landscape denuded of forestry with these multiple phased enclosures, and we start to see a different form of settlement where we see crannogs emerging, we see Atlantic roundhouses in the area emerging, and then eventually we see the introduction of these and the reuse of these citadel sites like Dumbarton and Dunolly and Dumbarton and Edinburgh. So a very different form of social structure emerging at that period. Now, we've only excavated a few of these sites. We need to do much more. Obviously, this is just one theory. But I think it's a different way. We have to look at these sites in a very different way than has traditionally been thought about. Thank you very much for listening. I want to thank, obviously, everyone at Northlight Heritage. It was obviously a difficult time back at 2019. And I wanted to say thanks to all the guys who worked there. It was a really honour to work at Northlight Heritage at the time. The project itself was managed by Gavin McGregor, and the site supervisors were Pettigrew and Dr. Adrian Maldonado. And I just want to say thank you all very much to all of the volunteers, many of whom are in the audience tonight. I know it wasn't ideal at times. I do really appreciate all the hard work you put in. And hopefully some of this evidence really shows that the work paid off. So thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me again.